Okay, so lately I've gotten into the habit of using motion capture data to test the deformations of my existing joint structure relative to the model I've created. And I do this before I create controls. And that's because you can't necessarily apply the motion capture data once you already have a control rig in place, because there's basically something already connected and feeding into the joint structure then. So usually what I'll do is I'll create my joint structure, bind it to the character, paint all the weights, and then start my testing. So if you wanted to do something like that, or even apply mocap data so you don't have to build the entire structure, so you can just show off your model, test it, things like that, all you have to do is go to Window, General Editors, Animation Editors, and choose HumanIK, and it'll bring up your character controls. So the first option we have here is called Create. Now with Create, you can actually have it create a basic game joint structure. Now the problem with a basic game joint structure is actually lacks many of the very specific things that you'd want to have in a character when you're actually controlling it and testing deformation, like control over the clavicle and the scapula area, a central hip that can actually move independent of your center of gravity. And just little things like that, little extras that you don't necessarily get in a generic humanoid joint structure. It's fine for games because mocap data, it basically just approximates everything based on a very restricted number of joints. Like, it doesn't need a ton of spine joints. It doesn't need the extra mobility of the hips and the pelvis and things like that. But usually when you're animating, you want those things yourself, because when you're hand animating, you need that extra control. Okay, but just for the sake of being thorough, if you actually were going to use the HumanIK controls or tools to create a basic joint structure, all you have to do is click on, under Create, you click on Skeleton, and it'll automatically create a joint structure as soon as you click on it. As you can see, I have a joint structure, but the joint structure scale by default is usually oversized. It's usually basically the size of what might be equivalent to a 6-foot skeleton versus my default centimeters. But of course, you can use the character scale to bring it down. Every time you bring it down, it resets so that whatever height it currently is, that becomes the default. Now, of course, you can always go through and change some of the settings. When you change the settings, it immediately updates the joint structure that was created, so you can add joints, remove joints, add more joints to the neck, remove some, add more to the shoulders. But you have to remember that this is sort of a generic script where it's not necessarily going to build everything according to your character. Usually when it comes to creating a joint structure, it is usually a better idea to build a joint structure specifically for your character so that it matches its contours, its proportions, and its the targeted functionality, because you'll never get everything you need out of a generic auto rigger or auto joint creation tool just because it doesn't know what you need. Okay, so personally, I will never use this tool to build joint structures. It's just a bad idea, waste of time. Usually I will create my own joint structures using Maya's joint tools, because it just gives me a cleaner and more precise result. It gives me the ability to assign control where I need it, or to modify structures to make them into anything I want without having the restrictions of being connected to an external tool. And of course, in doing so, you want to make sure that you create your joints, label everything. So shoulder, elbow, wrist. If you have something mid joints, let's say for the upper arm or something like that, make sure you label all those. Make sure you paint all your weights so that everything does exactly what you want it to do. Okay, and so once you have all your joints in place, you've bound your mesh to it, you've painted your weights, then you can go to Define, and you can actually tell the character controls, because the character controls are what we're going to use to assign mocap data to basically animate our little test rig. And we can tell it to define the skeleton. And so now we get this little character panel, which is basically waiting for us to tell it which joints are equal to the ones that it shows. Okay, and by default, it's going to show things in usually the T pose. You can actually go through its settings and tell it to expect a more of a inverted V pose, which is more common when it comes to game rigs, because usually game rigs Most people tend to model them, or some people tend to model them with the little inverted or the V pose, where it's more of a arms at a 45-degree angle. Personally, I don't like to do that because it actually limits the, or causes issues when it comes to the deformations in the shoulders here. Basically my opinion and my observation from years of experience. So T-pose usually give you a broader range of movement in the shoulders and the arms, and basically it's going to be a little less trouble when it comes to painting weights as well. So easy way to assign the joints is, it's really simple. Basically all you have to do is go to the joint that you see in the panel, double click on it, and when everything else grays out, all you have to do is go back over to your joints, click on one. So you click on the one that corresponds. So I clicked on the upper arm or shoulder area, and I chose the shoulder on the joints, and it automatically signed it. And also it automatically chose the equal opposite joint. Basically it looked to the other side to see if there was another joint to correspond there, so it mirrored their selection. So it's actually pretty easy. So I give elbow and elbow, wrist, or hand in this case. Okay, and I can do spine, and I'll just do the base of the spine. So that's that one right there. And now, since it's actually looking at it, wants to look at it like it's a game joint structure, I won't give it my independently rotating hip joint. I'll give it the cog, or the central root joint of the entire joint structure, because usually that's how the mocap data is recorded. It doesn't record it with an independent central hip that can actually move independent of the rest of the skeletal structure. Basically, it doesn't have a pelvis in a game rig. It just has the root and then the leg, so it's very basic. So I want to see the joints that I add to this to sort of mimic some of that to a certain extent, so that the mocap data will apply correctly. Okay, so I go to the left leg, double click on the left, and then double click on my left thigh joint there, knee. Okay, so it's pretty simple. And ankle. Okay, and so now I have pretty much all those joints. Still need the head, so double click on the head and get the head. Now for each one of these joints you can actually go even deeper. So I can actually go in and say, I can click on this little arrow in the circle, and I can go to the neck. Okay, I can tell it, so the base of the neck is going to be equal to, let's say, this joint here. Not really a neck, but I'll throw it in there anyway. And of course, if I don't like what's happening with this joint once I actually apply it, I can actually just right click on it and tell it to clear that. And since it is in one of the sub menus, it's not one of the top level joints. That means it doesn't have to actually be there. It's sort of an extra. There may not even be any recorded mocap data to apply to that one, but if you have it, you can plug it in there. But there are only certain ones. Basically, these top level ones have to be assigned, or else the mocap data will not be applied. It'll just give you errors until you actually assign them correctly. Now also, there is another issue that sometimes occurs where you'll assign the arm joints and then maybe it tells you that they're not parallel. Usually that just means it doesn't necessarily like the angle that you have the arms at. Now if I go to my character, you can see that I have the rotation Y on 5 already, when technically all the joints should be at 0. Now the thing is, with my structure at 0, when I go back to my character controls, it gives me an error because my arms are on a slight angle. They're basically not perfectly straight along the XY axes. Now when you're actually creating a joint structure to actually be hand animated, you actually need some angles in some places, basically preferred angles, so that you can actually put IK handles on them and control things properly. This is another way in which game joint structures are going to differ from joint structures that you actually need to hand animate and put other controls on. So to fix that, it's fairly simple. All you have to do is rotate the arms so that they're a little more parallel, and then as you can see, it immediately went green for everything. And so now it actually likes them because it can actually see that they are actually parallel. I just need to slightly adjust the angle. So now that's fixed, we need one other thing. There's usually a reference, basically a little control that sits at the base of every object that helps it establish where the starting point is. So usually what I'll do if I'm just testing something, if I haven't created a global control for a rig yet, what I'll do is I'll create like a little control cube, or you can create a locator, doesn't really matter, and I'll put it basically around his base, and I'll just take the root of my skeletal structure or the cog, and I'll just parent it directly to it. Okay, and so then when I go in and I can double click on this little diamond here between his legs or between his feet, and I can just click on my little global control there and tell it that that's the reference point. Okay, and so now this is entirely set up to receive mocap data. Okay, so once you've actually defined all of your joint structure that you need to control with the mocap data, usually you're going to have some joints left over, like I have a jaw joint, and I have the fingers, and I have the toes, and you can actually go in and assign these things. But like I said, a lot of mocap data won't necessarily have information to apply for these, but you can assign them if you need to, but they aren't necessary. And those are things that you can actually keyframe on your own, even with the mocap data applied, because they aren't connected. So if you're going to animate certain things on your own, then you don't want to assign them within your mocap data joint structure, because it'll make connections that you won't be able to override easily. Okay, but anything else, let's say I have, the clavicles here, or the shrug, depending on what you want to call it, you can assign those, and just like the top level joints, it automatically assigns any duplicates or mirrored versions. If you have any twist joints, you can assign those as well. There's usually a little space, usually in this case it calls them like the arm roll, and we have a little up leg roll. Those are all things you can assign if you want to. Okay, but once you have all of your joints assigned that you know you want the mocap data to control, and that you know the mocap data actually needs to control, then you need to access your mocap data. Now, if you're working in a version of Maya that's Maya 2015 or below, usually there is a little bit of mocap data built in or installed with Maya, and you usually have to dig for it. Now, I'm on a Mac. So with the Mac version, a lot of the files are actually contained within the executable file, within the app that you actually run to run Maya. It's actually a folder that you can actually dig down into. So if I want to get mocap data, I can actually reference it in. So I'm going to reference, not import, and I choose to reference so that I don't bring any unnecessary data that I don't want. Go to create reference, and bring up the option box so you can see this window. Now generally when I go to create a reference, I tell it to merge into selected namespace, and this way it basically doesn't create a lot of cluttered or overly complex names for anything that's referenced in. There's no prefix unless it clashes with something else, but basically it tries to keep things clean, simple, and it's a little easier to read through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my computer, I'm going to browse to my applications folder, go to the Autodesk folder, and go to Maya 2015. And if I go to the app itself and I double click on it, you can see that it's actually a folder. Go into the contents, and I'm going to the presets. Now on a Windows machine, usually wherever your presets are located, that's usually where the mocap data is going to be stored. So you just need to find that on Windows as well. Go to the mocap folder, and you have some examples. You can also go to the visor and bring them in via the visor, except you can't really import directly from there. But if you actually can find them in the visor, then you should be able to find out where they are in your machine. Okay, so what I can do is I can go to reference, and I can choose whichever one I want. So let's say I'm going to choose we'll choose a walk sequence, just to keep it simple. So I'm going to reference that in. Okay, so once you reference that in, it should, if it's actually mocap data or has mocap data in it, it should appear in your list of sources. if you look in your character controls window, beneath where it says character 1 is your character. Under sources, you should have a couple of things. You'll have none, which is basically where you start out. And then you should have whatever mocap data you just imported. So in this case, I imported a mocap example from Maya's resources. So as soon as you tell it the source mocap data, it will immediately reposition your character and pose him relative to however the mocap data starts. Okay, so when I rewind my timeline, I press play, you can see that now the joint structure is animated and the mesh with it. And so as you can see, my source data is actually coming from a much larger joint structure. And that's because it was captured based on a life-size human. Okay, now it doesn't really matter what scale it is, as long as the joints exist and it can apply the information to them. It doesn't matter what size it is, because I can actually take it and I can scale it down to more Michigan size, as you can see. So now they're about the same scale. If I rewind and press play, okay, now it looks like there's a slight difference just because Michigan is a little shorter and his leg span is shorter, and so it accounts for that in the data as well, which is actually nice. I'll take Michigan and move him to the side so that they don't overlap, so you can see them move side by side. Okay, fairly simple. And of course you can reference in multiple pieces of mocap data. So if I wanted to bring in a, let's say, a dance sequence, I could go back to my character controls and I could try that instead. And that comes in as my second mocap example. And since the character is of human proportions and Michigan is not, you'll see that some things don't quite mesh, and sometimes the captured data needs cleanup. So sometimes it doesn't always look great, but that's something you can always go back and fix by adjusting the source. Okay, so you can see that his arm is actually passing into his geometry. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to fix that on the source. Is I can take the source, I'll go select its root. Okay, I can select hierarchy, so I'm selecting all of those joints, add them to an animation layer. Okay, and so then within my animation layer, I can start making adjustments. So just to make it a little easier to see, I'm actually going to go to my outliner, find the reference for my dancer. So there's my dancer. I'm going to take that reference, I'm going to bring it down in scale so it's a little closer to Michigan in size, and so I can actually see the changes update a little easier. Okay, so as you can see, they're in the exact same pose, but the proportions on the source are much thinner. Michigan has a little more thickness to his upper body and his head area. So certain movements that might pass directly by the head on our more human character are going to cause some problems on Michigan. And so that's where you need to make some adjustments. And so basically you need to find those frames where it occur and find the joints that control those movements. So in this case we have a shoulder. And so around frame 57, we can see that the arm is passing by in front, but when it comes to Michigan, it actually causes the pass into his chest. So what I usually do is I'll take the two joints that are controlling that limb, so I'll take the elbow and the shoulder, and I'll key them on a frame just before the problem occurs. And as we get to the point where the problem is sort of most evident, I'll see where it actually passes by the problem. Okay, so we're actually past the problem now. and I'll key it before and after the problem, so it's locked those in. And remember, that's an animation layer, so that layer can be turned off at any time. But the changes on the animation layer will only affect the areas that are being updated. Okay? So now when I go back to, let's say, the middle of that action, I can take the joints that I've selected and I can maybe rotate them a little away from the body to try to fix this error. And I'll try to do a little more with the elbow, try to bring that arm out of his chest. Okay, so that's out now, but then maybe I want to rotate it so it's a little higher, bring it out, so it's changing it a little bit, and I'll need to update the other arm as well, just to make sure there's nothing odd going on there as well. And so once I have that elbow in the position I like, I can set a keyframe, and I can check the shoulder as well. Maybe I'll make a slight adjustment to that and bring it up a little higher. Okay, set the key on that as well. And so then I can scrub back through it and see if I've taken care of the problem. If I haven't, then maybe I need to go to another frame in here to make a few more adjustments. So I can rotate the arm a little more forward, so it brings the arm up a little faster and out a little more, and do the same thing with the elbow. And so this way I can do some cleanup in the animation to fix that turn. So if I look at it without the joint showing, I can see now I still have a problem before it, of course, but once I actually get to the area I fixed, you can see that now the arm doesn't intersect. It stays outside, at least until we perhaps reach another problem. But basically you can go through and make those adjustments as necessary. And as you can see, probably some of the weights need to be adjusted because some of these movements are very extreme, or I can just minimize some of the movements by, again, making adjustments to the mocap data. Okay, so other than directly and tweaking the mocap data animation, another option you could try, but I probably would not recommend, is you can actually go to this little blue button, which is actually a menu in your character controls, and you have access to pretty much all the same tools that you had access to from the top level menu. But if you actually want to make adjustments to the behavior of the joints that are actually being affected by the mocap data, you can come in, go to Edit, and go to Definition, and then choose to edit the properties. Okay, so what you get here is you actually get access to the connections that are actually feeding the mocap data into your joint structure, and you can set certain limitations on the rotations of your joints, such as you can even set limitations on the rotation of your reference object or the main control, and pretty much everything that you've assigned you can set limitations on. Is kind of a pain. It's usually a lot easier just to go in and edit the mocap data until you actually get the performance that you want.